Hi, I'm Mark Rosano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today we're going to go through the EIA data, and we're breaking it up into our three normal parts of it. Part one being that overview, part two being the deeper dive on what's happening with refined products, what are some of those impacts, and then the third segment we're going to go through exports and then do a little bit more in terms of what's happening with Libya, OPEC, and what can we expect as we go into the end of the year. So just jumping right in, when we look at the total crude draw, we have to understand what is impacting, because we do have some residual from the Hurricane Delta, which is now past. So we should see some normalcy as we go through this week and into next week. So here you can see that when we put in the SPR, there was a draw of about 1.77 million barrels. But the bigger issue that we've been trying to kind of hone in on is Cushing, because Cushing continues to build just because there's a very limited demand in order to move oil from Cushing into the coastal waters for the export market. So when we look at spreads and we look at kind of what's happening in the world, when we look at Louisiana Light Sweet and Magellan East Houston, which are two hubs that go into the international markets, we can look at Brent, and right now Brent and LLS are only about 40 cents, 50 cents away from each other. So it doesn't even cover the cost of shipping into Europe, as Europe becomes a much bigger issue as they have a lot of builds that are coming, which we'll talk about in segment 3. So the issue now is where does this crude go? And at this point, we've seen Cushing essentially continue to build a lot of oil going into there without coming south. And then from just, a bend by south, because Cushing's in Oklahoma, coming to the coast. And instead, we're having new oil coming from some of these different spots along the coast and just going and filling whatever demand is there going into Asia. Here you can see that we still had a residual from the production side. This has now been alleviated, so which means that just next week we'll be closer to 10.7 on our way back to 11. Just that as the Gulf of Mexico comes back. So you can see there should have been a bigger draw based on just not only the amount of production that was still offline, but also the amount of exports that went into the international market, which was about 3 million barrels a day, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit. The bigger issue is going to be Cushing, because Cushing is going to be that pricing hub. What is happening there? We're only about 5 million barrels away from when everyone was freaking out about tank tops. So this is just something to keep an eye on as we go through the remainder of at least October into November, and when we start to hopefully see a little bit more coming out of Cushing. So again, as we always do, we look at the SPR. We're starting to come a little bit of that normalcy. We're starting to see that trend. But again, the SPR pulls are just starting to slow down overall. The question is going to be, what does commercial stocks look like as we go through the remainder of shoulder season? So when we talk about those elevated levels, this recent bump, back to when tank tops became the term of the day, you could see that we were really close to those all-time highs, and we're continuing to move in that direction. And just based on the way flows are going, it doesn't look like that's stopping anytime soon. The question is going to be, how quickly do we get there? Do we start to see some normalization? And by normalization, we need to see prices get cut at the coast, which will then incentivize people to move out of Cushing and into the international markets. But right now, we're just not seeing that, which is why people are going to remain in storage. And again, it's just going to come down to, what does that cost? How do we get some of that crude into the market? And it's just becoming very difficult to see how we're not going to start getting a rise in builds over the next few weeks. And here's the commercial inventory as we take out the SPR. It's important to see that the trend continues to the downside, but we still remain above the top end of that cloud, setting those new, seasonally adjusted all-time highs. And you just looking at the top of the cloud, you can see we normally have that trend down. So we are trending in a seasonally normal direction. The question is going to be, when does that build come over? So here we have two different pieces. One, you have gasoline, where gasoline demand has been fairly stable. It's pared back, which we'll talk about. But that middle distillate, so the middle distillate and that diesel side, that's what we need to watch as we go into November. Are we going to have a cold start to the winter, a warmer start to the winter? That will really kind of adjust how much heating oil continues to get pulled through, because if you look at last week, We had a big push from recharging the system as people pulled heating oil into their tanks, topped off ahead of winter. And at the same time, we obviously had Hurricane Delta causing some disruptions. So these are things that we're going to have to continue to watch, because overall crude oil inventory still remains elevated for where we should be, especially this time of year. So as we go and we look at pad 3, you can see that there was a slowdown in terms of that pad 3 draw. Now, the problem here is this included a big increase in exports. So not only did we get Gulf of Mexico still down from Hurricane Delta, delays, but we also had a big increase in exports, and here we are. We're only here, which is why there remains a bigger concern as we go through the remainder of the year, where we're just not going to pull this crude through, especially because refinery runs continue to be well off of seasonal norms as we continue to trend lower. So here's a big backdrop as we look at imports. So like I said before, we had a big increase in exports out of pad 3, but we did have some normalization in terms of increases in imports. And again, it was just more about catching up, because we had the Hurricane Delta shut down the Loop, or the Louisiana offshore oil platform. We had several either canals and or ports that were shut down due to safety issues. So again, these were things that have started to alleviate, which pulled some additional crude in. And as we talked about last week, we expected to see a drop in pad 5. Again, this is all timely. So that's something where pad 5 is going to start to see an increase in imports. Pad 3 will start to slow down now that we've started to catch up a little bit. And then the question is going to be pad 2, where how much additional Canadian oil is being pulled through. And that's something that we think is going to remain elevated, but elevated in the way where we think we're going to be closer to just that 5-year average. Pad 1 is going to be fairly, not much to say one way or the other, just because we're going to have a big increase in imports of gasoline, but that's something that we're going to talk about in the second segment. And here is just where we talk about crude runs. So we talked about getting to about 72, 73 last week, and here we are at about 72.9, 73%. Again, it was driven by pad 3. Some of that will come back. We've had commentary from Valero that they're going to keep a facility down for a little bit longer. So we will get some of that coming back, not all of it. The question is going to be, the timing of when it actually starts to increase. But even though we're going to see some increase in runs, we're still going to remain in this 72 to 73% range, just because there just isn't that demand. And as we continue to look out, crack spreads continue to remain soft, especially now after this EIA report, as we have gasoline coming off. Diesel and distillate is holding on a little bit, but we're starting to see some of the softness as well, which is really being driven based on the amount of product that remains in storage across the globe, which again, we'll talk about in segment 3. And here's where we start to look at implied demand. So the benefit here is propane. Propane continues to be very strong. That's one of the bright spots that we continue to talk about with LPG, propane being pulled through not only the system, but also into the international markets. Now, the other benefit for propane is if you've been to a restaurant anywhere in the Northeast and in the Midwest, everyone's going to have propane heaters, just because if you could get them, great. Hopefully you were able to get them, but that's going to increase total propane demand, not only just domestically, but then it's going to remain strong into the international market. The bigger issue is going to be, gasoline, which we talked about was going to slow, which we'll go into greater depth as to why we think it's going to remain a headwind. But distillate was the one where we talked about it being a bigger issue as we headed into this this week, just because we had a breakdown in the amount of flow through. So when we look at distillate demand, we have to factor in the different pieces. So you had distillate being pulled through the system just because it had to get delivered to the local home. But now, where do we go from here? Like, this is one thing where we think distillate demand is going to start to soften as we go into November. Now, when we start to look at oil floating storage, it's at 0. That's just because you had ships moving back into position. You had some imports coming through. You have a delay in terms of coming in. So this is something where we're going to get an increase in floating storage. It'll just fall back within the bottom of the cloud. But again, it's not something that's going to remain. This is more just a timing issue and just how you classify floating storage. So this is something that we expect to see increase. But again, nothing crazy, just a little bit back to that bottom of the cloud. The bigger issue, and this is something that we talked about last week, we expected to see imports come back, but again, into the bottom of that cloud. And just based on kind of where we are here and what we see coming through, this is just going to go sideways. We don't think it's going to go down too much. It's just more along the lines of just kind of heading sideways and just staying within the bottom and just setting those, bumping along the bottom. And the reason why we say it's going to bump along the bottom in pad 3 is coming back to refinery utilization rates. So you can see the big drop. It's something that we've been talking about. We initially thought we'd get as low as 68, 70, but right now, again, we think that the low could be 70. But at this point, it will probably be closer to 72. And again, as we go through the remainder of October into November, you typically start to see refineries start to increase operations. And if you just look at that 29-year average, you can see that typically this is the low point, and then we start to see those increases back to, let's call it 92 to 93%. We just think that we're going to stay within this 75 to 80%, even as we go through and come out of shoulder season, just because, again, the demand isn't there and there's really nowhere to put this additional crude, which is going to keep refiners pared back, which is going to lead to not only a tough Q3, but also guidance into Q4, just because even though they're operating less volume, the margins still aren't there, and the crack spreads remain pressured, not only in the US, but also in the global market.